Hey there, YouTube. I'm Yukitsu. This is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to another Tuesday talk show. So this one's going to be quite late. I didn't finish Persona 5 until late Monday evening, technically like Tuesday morning. But yeah, I wanted to spend a little bit of time before I actually went and made a video about it, or a talk show about it, because I'm not really doing any video things here. But yeah, I wanted to sort of reflect on it and think about what I was going to say about it before we dove into this. But I am finally done the game. I'm going to do a New Game Plus because there's some Arcana that I didn't finish in terms of the social links, and there's one that I didn't even start. But yeah, it was a fantastic game. This is going to be absolutely filled with spoilers because we're going to be doing a deep dive analysis of the sort of elements of it. And the ending, in particular, is going to be dissected and torn apart and so on and so forth to a limited extent. I'm not necessarily that great at these sort of literary analyses, but I'm not that terrible at it either. So, yeah, if you didn't know necessarily where I was before, I was stuck really freaking hard in Mementos. That didn't change for quite a while. It took me way longer than it should have to actually get through all of Mementos and then get through the last phase of the game there as well. But we did eventually get there. I did eventually finally beat the stupid last boss there. And for those of you wondering, I think I got the true ending. Now, every Persona game has multiple endings that you can get. I think this game probably had at least 3. Usually there's decision points, and this game makes it really obvious when you're about to hit one, by giving you like all these save points and like this big dialogue box saying, "Are you sure you want to do that?" or whatever. But there was one section of the game where I wasn't actually sure if that ever happened, because I don't think I ever got a warning or anything like that I was about to make a wrong choice, or I guess I just wasn't going to make a wrong choice. But during the interrogation, they give you like 5 save points just for talking with the prosecutor. So I'm almost guaranteeing that there's some way to get a different ending if you talk differently in that one from what I did, but I don't really know what I did to make it not proc. The other thing is when you're talking to Igor, there's, or not Igor rather, there's actually a point where he offers to reverse the whole situation and make it so that people worship the Phantom Thieves and rely on them, and you can continue going about changing people's hearts. In this particular ending, I think what he's actually offering for you is that you will continue to act as sort of a jailer for him, or the police for him, and locking people's subconscious minds up in mementos when they sort of get free. Because what you find out when you're in mementos is that the people's shadows, when they escape the depths of mementos, are sort of rampaging about and acting violently or whatever. Those guys are actually free. They're doing this because they're able to act out and so on and so forth. And what you're doing is when you beat them, they go back to the jail in mementos. So what you're ultimately doing is working to deny these people their freedom, and they are still criminals, and they still deserve to have some sort of punishment brought against them. But the way that you're sort of going about doing it is by putting them back into the cage that everybody has sort of naturally put themselves into. All the people in there mostly put themselves in there, and just a few people sort of broke themselves out, and they're sort of railed against not only by society at large, but also by the Phantom Thieves and everybody else. So ultimately, what you're fighting for throughout most of the game is actually control, in a sort of weird sense there. Putting these people back in line and in their sort of place there and into their sort of slot in society. But it's a little bit weird that that's kind of the case. I'm not necessarily sure exactly what would have happened in that other ending, though, because the sort of fake Igor is a known liar, so I'm not sure if he would have actually held up his side of the bargain or if he just would have destroyed the world, because I kind of get the feeling like that's probably what he would actually have done there, is just blown up the world or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, the ending that I did get is the one where you actually destroy Jaldabaoth. I was actually correct. The song Jaldabaoth is from when you fight that boss, so the soundtrack continues to ruin the game, but it's a fantastic soundtrack, and I really like listening to them, so I pick them up and I start listening to them, and it's great. But then you get these songs that just ruin the entire sort of they spoil everything, which is still fine because honestly speaking, I don't actually know what Jaldabaoth, even after fighting it, even after looking it up on Wikipedia and trying to figure out what the hell's going on, I still don't really know what the hell's going on. So just knowing the name didn't really actually spoil anything significant other than it's like, okay, now I know the name of the last boss. It doesn't mean anything to me because I don't know what the hell's going on. But yeah, so I was correct. The name Jaldabaoth was the only song that I hadn't heard in the game yet, and it does apply to the final boss, who is that entity. So yeah, it was a pretty interesting final encounter there. Very, very difficult, but probably not as hard as like the fight against Elizabeth or the fight against even Margaret. So not the hardest fight in Persona series. Probably, I don't know. Maybe it was harder than Izanami. Maybe it was harder than. I think Nyx was actually probably a little bit harder, but only because Nyx takes like an hour to beat, and this guy takes like a half hour to beat. So, there's that difference, basically. So yeah, in the ending that I got, you actually rescind all of your powers by destroying mementos, and you stop changing people's hearts. But not only that, but then you throw yourself into jail afterwards, and what happens is that everybody that you formed a social link works really hard to get you out of jail. So I wanted to touch back on something that I talked about earlier, in that there is a dominant arcana to the Persona games. In Persona 3, like I mentioned earlier, it's the Death Arcana, and it's very blatant that the Death Arcana is the most important one to that particular game. Persona 4, a little bit less blatant about it, but it's still pretty obvious that Persona 4 is most heavily related to the Justice Arcana. Persona 5, strangely enough, the character for the Arcana is not that important. I didn't even max their social link. But the primary arcana for Persona 5, in my opinion, is the Hanged Man. Not only just is the Hanged Man kind of appropriate for one where you are a condemned criminal, but what the Hanged Man actually means is it's about things like self-sacrifice. It's about kind of reaching enlightenment through that kind of martyrdom, and so on and so forth. Now, this also applies to 3 to a lesser or greater extent, but what Persona 5 also has in it that Persona 3 didn't was that you are supposed to surrender, that you're supposed to give up, and you're supposed to stop fighting. And that's not what happens in 3. In fact, arguably the character from Persona 3 is going to be in some capacity fighting back against the encroachment of Nyx and I can't remember the name of the other one for like the rest of forever. Whereas in Persona 5, you've given up your ability to be Phantom Thieves, you've given up your ability to change the world and change people's hearts, in a sense, and in that you sort of come to the realization that you can change the world without mementos, and you can change the world without those powers, is what the Phantom Thieves sort of decide on. And the way that they sort of first prove that is that they all band together and make sure that the main character gets out of prison and that Shido does go to trial for what he had done. So, again, this does actually fit very well in with the concept of what the Hanged Man is. It's the main character in a certain sense relinquishing his power and sacrificing himself for everyone else, and when that happens, everything comes to him. In fact, once you decide and make the ultimate decision that you're going to destroy mementos and oppose Jaldabaoth, and you're going to oppose control, and you're going to do all that, and that's the final decision that you get to make that makes certain that you're going to lose your ability to be a Phantom Thief, and your ability to sort of continue the fight. You'll still have that one fight left to do, but you've ultimately made the decision to give up your powers at that point in time. And I'm not necessarily sure that you actually have. There's too many... It was too popular a game, I suspect, and too crossover friendly for them to not, for example, make some sort of sequel to Persona 5. Like, they're already making the dancing game, although I'm not entirely sure how that relates to the core canon of things. I think they're supposed to be canon. I'm also not sure where that fits into the timeline, but if it is like Persona 4 is dancing all night or whatever, what's going to happen is that they'll have some other encounter afterwards, which will demonstrate that they still have access to their ability to use personas. So what that means is ultimately they didn't actually give that up, but I think that that sort of ruins the message of the story, or we could also take it to mean that they didn't get the true ending as the canonical one. Like, I mean, in all the other Persona games, I think that they actually imply that you don't finish a lot of social links when you complete the game or something like that, or could be something else, but the sequel games seem to imply that a lot of weird stuff, like the main character still uses the base Persona and stuff like that in the Ultimax Arena stuff like that. So anyway, what was the ending exactly? Well, what happens is the fake Igor turns out to be the collective desire for everybody in society and their desire to be imprisoned. And he's sort of having a competition, I guess, with Igor, the actual Igor, in a certain sense there, and trying to figure out what humanity will do and how they will react. But he's trying to rig that game so that it goes in his favor, but ends up underestimating, I suppose, humanity in its sort of ways. But yeah, I think there is sort of that reciprocative action going on between the way society is feeding into the idea that they want to be imprisoned, and it is also sort of granting them that wish subconsciously. They refer to it as the sort of holy grail, and if they worship it, it'll solve all their problems for them without them having to do anything themselves. Now, Jaldabaoth, because like I've said before, I'm more on the side of like law, order, control, that sort of thing. I can empathize with a few of its points there, but reject its sort of ultimate conclusion. I do think that, people are inherently lazy. They're quite bad. They want to be safe even at the expense of others. They want to just sort of have something they can do. And even I do think that there are plenty of people who are willing to sort of march off a cliff of self-destruction. I think that describes a lot of humanity, but I don't think that means that there's all those flaws mean that you need to reject humanity or that there's not hope for them. So despite the fact that I do agree with a lot of the points that this particular antagonist actually makes, I don't actually really want to agree with it, which is why I sort of fought back against it, or chose that option. Now, for all I know, again, maybe there is actually a better ending in there somewhere, and maybe there's a way to get a different ending. But I think that this one worked out really well. One of the things that I actually did like about this, despite the fact that you can't actually go back into mementos anymore, and the fact that you can't change people's hearts anymore, unlike in Persona 4, which I think, again, had the weakest ending, even though it has the same ending where you leave to go home, because that completes the hero's journey, what happens in this one is that rather than you simply getting on a train and departing like in Persona 4, or you being dead like in Persona 3, what happens in Persona 5 is that the Phantom Thieves all get together one last time to sort of drive you home, and it really implies that even though you can't change people's hearts anymore, you're going to keep doing what you were doing before anyway. Even though you can't do it the same way, you can still do it. And I think that was actually a really interesting ending, and I thought that was a strong way to end that off. I really did actually like this particular one. The only one that was better was Persona 3's, and that's because of how well it tied in everything else, as far as the characters, the plot, the themes, the genre even. We were all sort of congealed into one very, very powerful moment. This one just gives you a much sort of nicer feel to it, where, even Persona 4 was a little bit bittersweet there, because, goodbyes always suck. That's not what happens in Persona 5, because you're not really saying goodbye to anybody. So, yeah, I think that worked out really well there. So, yeah, I think that it was kind of interesting, this game. It wasn't meant to be a mystery game like Persona 4 was, so the whodunit elements of it were really quite easy to figure out, and when there were surprises, it was because the game was doing something that was completely sort of off the rails. It's like, what the hell is Satan doing here, and why did he shoot God in the face with all of mankind's evil, and why is that a good thing? Like, I don't quite understand what is going on here, sort of thing there. I'm actually really surprised that, like, those really nutjob Christian people who, like, complain that Pokemon is devil worship aren't complaining about this game. I get the feeling like they would, if they ever actually figured out that this exists, would be a lot more angry about this than they would be about Pokemon, but apparently, like, I don't know. I guess it's just Pokemon's more visible, and Harry Potter's more visible, so, they've got to have their cartridge and book burnings about something, and they can only do it about things they know about. But yeah, it was it was an interesting journey. It was too long. It was way too long, but at the same time, I still feel like I could have kept playing it, even if it had been another like 20 hours long. What actually happens is like you hit December and you get chucked in jail, and then there's some cut forwards for like 3 months. So you actually miss out on 3 entire months worth of potential content. Like I said, these games take place over a year, invariably, and the thing about this is that if you're going to skip over an entire like 3 months worth of content, that means that the 120-hour game could have been 160 hours if they had not done that skip. It's just one of those things where just realizing that just boggles the mind. It's like, oh my god, why was I playing this for so much of my time, and why am I willing to sit through it again? Well, it's because it was a really good game. I can be honest there. I think that out of all the games, the way I sort of rate them, I can't honestly say that I like any of them super more than any of the others. Persona 3, like I said, I think it had the best story, just with basic story plot elements and the way that was structured. I think it was the strongest in terms of the build-up and the structure, and the ending and conclusion I thought was easily the best there. For characters, I'm having a difficult time just deciding whether I think Persona 4 or Persona 5 had the better characters. To a certain extent, I think Persona 4 had the better characters. Persona 5, I think, was probably the most fun to play out of all of them. I think it also had sort of the it sort of sits like in the middle in both characters and story, whereas I think Persona 4 had probably the weakest story by a very slim margin, and Persona 3 easily had the worst characters. Like even Persona 3, which has the worst characters, still has really good characterization and character development and fun characters for a video game. Most games don't get anywhere near as good as Persona 3 even. But it's still the weakest out of those 3, because that's just how high the bar is set for the series. And Persona 4, I think, has probably some of the most interesting characters in literally any game in existence there. They're just, even if you don't like them, always a lot of fun to talk to and interact with. So that's kind of the way that 4 works. Persona 5, I think the secondary characters, the non-party members, are probably stronger than the non-party members in Persona 4, and certainly more than Persona 3. Although Mr. Edogawa was probably one of my favorite NPCs of the entire series. I don't know. But yeah, like, all the people that you talk to that are not part of your group are, I think, a lot more interesting in Persona 5 than they were in Persona 4. It's just the team members and the core cast that I thought was more interesting in 4 than 5. And even then, it's relatively close, so that's how sort of close the characters are in Persona 4 and 5. Like, Persona 5 takes second place by a narrow margin in so many categories that it's easy to say that it could be the strongest overall game, even though it's not necessarily the absolute best in very many categories other than gameplay itself. And gameplay is not that important to the Persona series, even though it was a lot of fun to play and the mechanics are crisp and good for a JRPG in particular. The core mechanics of these games just really isn't actually all that important to the quality of the game as a whole. So the fact that that's up there is fine, but it's probably not the best part. For music, I'm probably, like, music, you can't even really say which one's the best for which one. All of the games have really fantastic soundtracks, and they're almost incomparable because each of them sort of is the best fit for their own game. So I find it hard to sort of judge them on that particular merit there, although Persona 5 has some really fantastic songs in it. In particular, I really like the ones with lyrics in them. Rivers in the Desert, Last Surprise were both really fantastic songs, but also the one where you're just sort of hanging around LeBlanc was quite nice. So it had a good soundtrack, I thought. But so did Persona 4, so did Persona 3. I can't really judge those all that accurately. But yeah, that is kind of my thoughts about the game sort of as a whole. But let's talk a little bit about something related to Carl Jung, perhaps. Alright, so we're going to be talking about individuation again here, and what's interesting about Persona 5 as compared to Persona 3 or Persona 4 is that, yeah, while each of the characters sort of goes through a hero's journey in both Persona 3 and Persona 4, both of those feel a little bit less like they're about the main character themselves reaching any sort of form of enlightenment. And while there is that kind of element to it, it's not as explicit as it is in Persona 5, where it's really about the main character coming to terms with freeing themselves ultimately was what Persona 5 ended up being about. And not just freeing yourself from the shackles of some sort of outside force. What Persona 5 ended up being about at the very, very end, I feel, was the main character Joker, or whatever you ended up naming them, freeing their heart from the sort of judgments and perceptions of the outside world that were cast upon him by realizing that he doesn't have to be beholden to those ideas. Because your condition at the end of the game, materially speaking, is the same as it was at the start of the game, other than the fact that you've now got friends and allies, of course, which makes a big difference in your ability to sort of approach this. But there are still plenty of people who are going to accuse him of being a criminal, of pointing at his back record and so on and so forth, even though he's been released and his criminal record's been expunged and so on and so forth. All of that doesn't really stop people from labeling you or judging you. And his friends know that, and he knows that, and he's going away from the people that he's associated with. He's going home. And even though they come with him to a certain extent, they're still not going to be there for him all the time. And, that makes a really profound difference in the fact that he's going back into that sort of climate of not having friends necessarily, of people judging him and labeling him. But while at the start of the game you're sort of alone, you're bemused, and you're sort of confused as you enter Shibuya, and you don't really have any people to rely on or turn to or anything like that. The main character looks quite troubled and unhappy, but at the very end of 5, you're actually seeing the main character very content and very happy with things, despite the fact that he's still being observed by police officers, he's still being labeled by others as a criminal, he's still got all that stigma attached to him by society. But he's opted that his personal reflection is now that he doesn't need to worry about that anymore. Because he himself he has the confidence to sort of rely on himself instead of the judgments of others and so on and so forth. And he's got other people that he can sort of rely on because of the connections that he's built up over the years and so on and so forth. So despite the fact that he's got the same sort of conditions at the end of the game in many respects, a lot of it is just sort of that perspective shift, as the sort of Phantom Thieves themselves mention. It's a change in their cognition about the situation rather than an actual change of the situation. And in fact, the game actually ends on an interesting note, because while you did save the world from sort of Jeldabaoth, you actually don't change anything. There are still very obviously corrupt people in the world, and they still are trying to sort of abuse the system and the hierarchy that's in place. And they're still actually fairly evil people out there trying to just profit from whatever situation they can. And so on and so forth. They make that quite explicit with the way the police are interacting with Joker at the end of things, and why he needs to be arrested in the first place, because otherwise, they can't get that conviction out of Shido, even though he sort of confessed to everything, and so on and so forth. All of that sort of comes together, and you didn't really change the way the world works. All you've done is you've solved this sort of one few set of problems out there, but it's just basically the fact that you're now relying on other people instead of thinking that you're the only ones that can change it. You're sort of more accepting that that's kind of the way the world is to a certain extent there. It's an interesting ending in that sort of sense there, because it sort of comes full circle back to where you were before. Rather than having enacted great change to the world, you've saved it from one sort of event there and just allowed it to sort of be as it was before, having failed to sort of change it, and that's fine. I think that, again, is part of that sort of Hangman Arcana. Now, the process of individuation is essentially an archetypal journey, and for Carl Jung, he would have gone through, for example, the persona, and you go from there to the shadow, and then you sort of resolve that, and then you continue through each of the different archetypes, be it like something like the wise man, the anima, the mother figure, the hero, so on and so forth, and through whatever he happens to use. I don't remember Carl Jung's specific archetypes all that well, because they're not necessarily too well defined, because they're not meant to be. Generally speaking, what people will do is actually use a different medium. For example, the tarot deck is another medium that you can use that sort of are easy made already archetype that you can sort of use. You can also use things like Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. That's also an archetypal journey. That sort of hero's journey is the same sort of thing. The fool's journey is the same sort of thing. The I Ching can also be used. Any of those sorts of things all work for Carl Jung's theory of the persona and of the of individuation rather. And it's meant to work that way. That's sort of what his point was, that the collective unconscious causes all of these different cultures to have the same process with the same sort of archetypes, or similar enough archetypes, or close enough archetypes that you go through that process to get to a state of enlightenment. The tarot deck works just as well as any of those other ones. So for this particular game, what you're doing is you're starting off in a state where, you've got essentially nothing. You come to a new town where you don't know anybody. You don't have anything in your possession, and that's the start of the fool's journey. You have unlimited potential because you don't have anything that you're attached to. And you sort of go through each of the arcana. Notably, you don't necessarily go through them in order in the Persona games. Generally speaking, you will meet the magician as one of the first characters, if not the first character that you interact with, and almost always is the first character that you form a social link with. In Persona 3, it's Junpei represents that arcana, and you meet him like 5th or something like that. You meet actually the Lover's Arcana first, Yukari, but I think that you, generally speaking, start off with Kanji as your first social link, who is the magician. Persona 4, it's a little bit cleaner. You start off with Yosuke, who is the magician arcana, and he starts off like right in your face, basically, being one of the first people you associate with. Chariot is one of the earlier ones as well. Like the earliest ones are things like the Chariot, the Priestess, the magician, the priestess. I can't actually remember the order that they go in all honesty. It's like 20 of them, and I can't put them in order. But yeah, so you don't necessarily have to go through these in order in the Persona games. That's fine. But the point is the sort of process that you go through of encountering all these different sort of ordeals and sort of coming up through all of them stronger than you did when you started off the sort of journey. They don't necessarily break the game into those parts, though, and they sort of can't make it so that you go through the journey cleanly, because you sometimes resolve different parts of different arcanas at different times. So it's a little bit stretching to say that you actually follow the Fool's Journey in the classical sense there, but you sort of do in the very, very broad sort of sense of it. Quite often, the general overarching plot, you'll have one or two characters that actually describe the arcana that you're dealing with. It's almost always a fortune teller. In Persona 3, there was someone that you could talk to in the nightclub that would tell you what arcana was dominant in the story. At Persona 3, like, they did have you travel through the arcana month by month by month, but it didn't really relate to the story all that well, because the story wasn't tied in necessarily to the month that you were dealing with. Maybe it was, and I just missed it, actually. It's been a while since I played Persona 3. And honestly, like, the bosses for Persona 3 were kind of boring. So even though that there might have actually been the case that they were enacting those sort of parts of the arcana, it doesn't feel like it was. Persona 4 as well, you go through the individual plot beats of the main storyline. It didn't necessarily feel like they were related necessarily to the individual arcana, but at the same time, you're still going through the overarching journey from beginning to middle to end. It's more accurate to say, in fact, that the story's overall structure in each of these games fits the hero's journey a little bit better than the fool's journey in that particular case there, because it starts off in that sort of sense of, you start off with nothing, you're compelled to move somewhere, and then you're given the call to action, and you sort of go all that through all that, getting great power, different allies, and so on and so forth. You encounter the wise man who trains you. That would be Igor. After you sort of attain great power, you give that power up and go home, or you keep that power and go home. And in each of these games, you actually do, other than 3, you actually do sort of leave wherever it is you. Well, actually, even in 3, you do leave the place that you spend your adventure. So, it's an answer to the call, and then you sort of finish the call and you leave. That's sort of the way that sort of goes. A little bit less so with the Fool's Journey, but I again think that the Fool's Journey actually applies best to the character in Persona 5, because he himself seems to be much more changed in 5 than he does in the main character in 3 or 4. And generally speaking, that's because the process is actually, again, that process of reaching that state of enlightenment that he has at the end. He starts off the game in a fairly miserable state. He's a lot less, I think, happy than the main character in 3 or 4. I mean, yeah, the main character Persona 3 is there because his parents had died, but that had happened a while ago. He'd been an orphan for quite some time. And this was just another school. Like, there was no expectation that was going to be really bad for him. In Persona 4, you're going to move in with some people who already, while they're a little bit uncomfortable with you, they're still family, and you're going to be able to adjust to that sort of thing. You know that's going to take a bit of adjustment. Persona 5, you get there and there's really nothing for you. You're a social outcast because your bad reputation makes it so it's impossible to approach anybody, and it really is just society is going to label you, judge you, and just keep pushing you down. But by the end of it, he's still in that same state. He still has that sort of stigma of having had a criminal record. He still has that sort of stigma of being attached to that. And he still has all those people who are going to want to keep pushing him down. You actually see those individuals in the car tailing behind you, trying to keep tabs on you, assuming that you're up to no good. But unlike in the beginning, the main character is still free. He's still happy. It's the shackles of his own heart that he sort of destroys symbolically with our scene in that one moment before he summons Sataniel, which is, an interesting dynamic there. His position in life hasn't necessarily changed all that much. It's his perspective on life that has changed significantly, and the people that he's with, the bonds he's sort of forged as he went along that path. And all of that sort of combined has led him to that sort of state of enlightenment that he achieves at the end of Persona 5. And that fulfills that sort of fool's journey much more so than I think the hero's journey does, or Persona 4 does, or Persona 3 does. So it's an interesting thing because it does actually result in a sort of self-enlightenment, whereas Persona 3 and 4 didn't, making it a little bit closer to that sort of idea of individuation. Now, the social links aren't necessarily about that process in this particular game. I think that's because it's supposed to be the main character's rehabilitation, as it were. Whereas in Persona 4 and Persona 3, it's really about rehabilitating, in particular 4, it's really about rehabilitating the people that you're talking to. It's about reforming them. It's about fixing their problem with their own self. They're coming to terms with their own inner demons. Whereas in Persona 5, when you're talking to these people, their problems are usually external. While they do have their own sort of self-confidence problems or their own issues with dealing with the situation at hand, generally speaking, these people are being pushed down by society, and the way you fix their problem is by removing that foot that's holding them down, that's stepping on them. And this sort of helps them sort of move past that blockage that they couldn't get past in their life. For the main character, again, that's not really the case. So I do think that Persona 5 is kind of this mixed case of having less individuation overall, because that's not what the individual social links are about, whereas that was the case in 4. Whereas in 5, I think that the whole journey is the case of individuation for the main character. So anyway, that's my thoughts on the game up to this point. Like I said, I'm going to be playing a New Game Plus. I will be taking it fairly slowly, though, so I'm not going to be as interrupted or sort of delayed with my other normal content here. But that does also mean that I'm not going to have really all that much to talk about. So, yeah, I hope you found this one enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you guys all next time.